let's jump right into SaaS metrics. I'm going to start with the really basics, the concept of ARR and MRR, because we actually see founders sort of get this wrong at the early stages. So ARR is annual recurring revenue. And it's actually pretty simple if you understand it just and keep it very straightforward. It's the sum of all your subscription revenue expressed as an annual number. So the key point is it makes no difference whether a customer is on a 1 month, 6 month, 1 year, or even a 2-year subscription. If that customer stayed with you for a year, how much subscription revenue would they pay you over that year? That's your ARR from that customer. Okay. MRR is the exact same thing, but expressed as a monthly number. Regardless of whether someone's on a 1, 6, or 12-month contract, what's that prorated monthly amount? That is your MRR. The key thing to remember is that ARR and MRR, it's just 2 ways of saying the exact same thing. ARR is always MRR times 12. A lot of mistakes that founders make is they think that, all right, maybe MRR relates to customers that are on monthly contracts and ARR is more relevant if I've got customers on annual contracts, but that's actually not true. It's just the same way of saying, 2 different ways of saying the same thing. If you're a company with, 1.2 million in ARR, you've got $100,000 of MRR, regardless of your contract size. So I'm going to give some examples just to sort of hammer this point home. All of the companies I'm about to show you are 12K ARR customers and 1K MRR customers. So your first customer, customer A, pays you $1,000 per month on a month-to-month contract. It doesn't matter that they're on a month-to-month deal. They represent 12K of ARR and they're 1K of MRR. Customer B pays you $6,000 up front on a 6-month contract. They are still 12K of ARR and 1K of MRR. 12K up front on a 1-year contract, and D, 24K up front on a 2-year contract. All of these customers increase your MRR. If you close any of these deals, you've increased your MRR by 1K, $1,000, and your ARR by $12,000. So it's just as simple as that. It is completely independent of when they pay you. If you're giving them net 30 terms, net 90 terms, it has to do with when their contract goes live and when they're using your product. Okay, now let's go on to the concept of churn. I'm going to talk about and define 3 different types of churn that you want to be aware of as a SaaS business. And almost everything I'm saying today relates primarily to B2B SaaS. B2C SaaS, generally tracks these same metrics, but with some different nuance twists. So the first thing is the concept of customer churn. So customer churn is simply the percentage of existing customers that you lose in a given month. Most people track their churn monthly. So that's why I'm doing a month. You can do it quarterly or annually, but monthly is the norm. So let's take an example. I'm going to use the same example company for each of my churn examples. So you have 68 customers at the beginning of the month, and you lose 2 of them. They cancel their subscriptions. So that's just 2 divided by 68. You had 2.9% customer churn. Okay, so the next churn metric to be aware of is revenue churn. So it's the same concept of customer churn, but instead of calculating what percentage of your customers you've lost, it's what percentage of your revenue you have lost. So in that company with 68 customers had 85K MRR. And at the beginning of the month, and 2 of those customers turned out in the month. And one of them was a $1,000 a month customer, and one of them was a $500 a month customer. So I lost $1,500 of MRR, and I started with 85. So that was 1.8% revenue churn. So from a revenue perspective, my churn wasn't as bad as my customer churn because it turned out it was 2 of my smaller customers that left. And now let's look at the last one, which is probably the most important one to understand. It's the concept of net churn, or sometimes called net revenue churn. And this is the percentage of your existing MRR So whatever MRR you started with at the beginning of your month, it's how much MRR you lost, your revenue churn, offset by any upgrades or increases in MRR from your existing customer base. So for this company right now, we know we started with 68 customers and we had $85,000 in MRR. So let's look a little deeper under the hood and see what happened. We know we lost $1,500 in MRR from those 2 churn customers, but it turns out that we also had upsells from existing customers. I don't know if it was from one customer or across 3 different customers, and we gained $900 in MRR. So at the end of the day, we only lost $600 in MRR from our customer base. So that's 600 divided by 85,000, and we had 0.7% net churn. So net churn is really the most important one that you want to track, but you want to be aware of them all. And one thing to realize is net churn can sometimes be negative. So it could have been the case that we lost $1,500 in MRR from 2 customers that churned, but maybe we had $2,500 in upsells. In that case, it would have been, minus 1,000 over 85,000, and we would have had net negative churn. That means your MRR is growing from your existing customer base without you having to sell anyone new. So let's talk about churn a little bit more, and let's talk about how this relates to early stage companies, because early stage SaaS companies always have much, and I would say much, much higher churn rates than later stage companies. And so why is this? Well, there's 2 really key reasons. The first is that, your product is nothing like it will be 3 years from now. It's not as robust. The functionality isn't as good. The feature set isn't as good. It probably has more bugs. And so you're just not going to be providing as much value with that product as you will down the road. And another key one, which sometimes is even more important, is you have no clue early on about your ideal customer profile. So you're usually selling in this sort of scattershot method where you're pretty much trying to sell to everyone that will say yes. And at the end of the day, the reality is there are some subsets and profiles of customers that your product's going to drive significant value to. And there's going to be others that it won't. And it's not necessarily that you have a bad product, it's just a bad match. And early on, you tend to sell to all of those. And as you become more mature, you learn to focus primarily on your ideal customer profile. And once both of these improve, your churn rates go down. So at the end of the day, don't get too focused on churn early on. Like if it's crazy high, you'll know that it's a problem. But don't get focused on, the exact percentage. Instead, when you're early in your life cycle, and I would say even below $1 million in ARR, view churn customers as a learning experience. And what it lets you do is it helps you make your product better. You can understand, why are your customers churning? Is there a bug or a problem with your product that's causing a pain point for some customers? There is some key piece of functionality that's missing. And if you had that, some of those customers wouldn't be churning. And like I said before, equally as important, figure out what profiles of companies your product provides the most value to and what profiles you should avoid because they tend to churn. And a profile can be certain segments. You might be selling to a variety of different industries and some are better than others. Or it could be that within a given industry, it depends on the size. There's certain size customers that are ideal or certain ones that have hired for certain roles inside. And if they have, that's a signal that they'll get a lot of value out of your product. As your company grows and your ARR gets larger, net churn is the most important churn metric to track. That's the last one we talked about on the previous page. And what I'm going to do is talk about the goals when you get quite large. I'll jump ahead to sort of when you're at a 10 million plus ARR run rate, because as you get larger, churn becomes a really strong headwind. So it's not that big a deal if you've got $1 million in ARR and you lose, 20% of your customers churn out over a year. That's easily replaceable, and you can lose 20%, and you can still grow from 1 million to 2.5 million ARR that year. It gets harder if you're at 10 million and you lose 2 million in ARR. It's harder to grow quickly, but it's still possible. when you're at 100 million and you lose 20 million in ARR in a year, you might barely be growing at that point. And a lot of companies stop growing in that 10 to $15 million range, when they have churn up in that, 3% plus range. So here are the goals eventually, once you're pretty large and established. Ideally, you want to get to less than 1% net churn. If you get that, you're in the very good category. If you're below 0.5%, you're solidly in the great category, and the sort of ultimate ideal and the gold standard, and it's very rare to achieve this consistently over time, is net negative churn. And one of the things to understand is what's required to even have net negative churn as a possibility. Well, you have to be able to upsell your existing customer base. So if you have a product where you're charging a single price, and it's once, you pay and then you get to use it as much as you like, your net churn is going to be the same as your revenue churn, because you're generally not upselling your customers. If you've got a product that is, you charge per seat or per some unit metric, and your customer starts using it more, you can grow. If you've got more than one product and you just sort of start and you land in a company and you sell one of your products and you can expand and upsell to a different product, that's another way where you can eventually get to net negative churn. So now let's go to another common metric, CAC. So CAC is referred to by two acronyms that we see. One is customer acquisition costs, or cost to acquire a customer. Two ways of saying the same thing. So calculating your CAC is simple, though a lot of people will do it wrong. But the key point is it's every single all-in dollar that you spend on your sales and marketing divisions in a month divided by the customers acquired. And you can do it monthly, you can do it quarterly, it doesn't matter. Just if you're doing it quarterly, use customers acquired in a quarter and your costs in a quarter. And all-in dollars means every penny spent on salaries in sales and marketing, on payroll taxes, on benefits. If you're working out of a WeWork and you're paying $700 or $1,000 a month for a desk, factor in that $700 or $1,000 a month for your sales and marketing people. And then you divide it by your number of customers that you've acquired. Now, the catch is that when you're a pretty young startup, you can't even know this number at all. You don't ever get a really good grasp on CAC until you get to 10 million and plus in ARR. You start to have a decent grasp of it when you get to that $2 to $5 million range. And when you're lower than that, your CAC is highly variable and you almost always undercalculate it. So why is it variable? Well, because at that stage, your sales is pretty lumpy, right? You might close no new customers in a given month, or it might be 2 one month and 5 the next. As your company grows, you might close 22 customers one month and 18 the next, and your CAC isn't going to be as variable. But here's the most important thing to understand is that the dominant contributing factor to CAC is payroll expenses for sales and marketing. And what's happening early on in your business? Well, early on, founders do most of their selling, and founders, they often work for free. And if not, they're working for way below market wages. And it's not just the founders that are doing that. The wages and the benefits of all your early employees, almost always below market. So let's say I've calculated my CAC for my product and I've determined that my CAC is $4,000, and I'm at 30K MRR. Well, I can guarantee you that if I fast forward 3 years from now and nothing else changes, my CAC might go from $3,000 to $5,000 or $6,000, because those employees that are working in the sales and marketing departments, they're going to be paid much more closer to market value salaries. So ultimately, you want to understand how to calculate CAC from the get-go, but don't get too focused on it until you start to get to larger ARR numbers. So we'll jump into LTV now. So LTV is lifetime value of a customer. So if you close a new customer, what's the expected amount of time they're going to stay with you, and how much subscription revenue will you get from them? So the most commonly used formula is you take your average MRR per customer, sometimes called average revenue per customer, but just think of it as what's your average customer MRR, and then you're multiplying it by 100 divided by your monthly churn. And what is 100 divided by your monthly churn? That, if you look at that second line, it's essentially the average number of months that a customer lasts. So if you take 100 and let's say you have 2% monthly churn, so you divide 100 by 2, means your average customer is lasting with you for 50 months. So you're basically taking your average MRR and you're multiplying it times 50. So it's pretty simple. That's what you're doing. So let's take an example. Across your customer base, you have $500 of average MRR and you've got 2.4% monthly churn. It's $500 times 100 divided by 2.4. Your LTV is a little under $21,000 per customer. There are actually two problems with this formula that I listed above, and this is the formula that most people use for calculating LTV. The first is it doesn't account for gross margins. The reality is you don't get to spend all $500 of that MRR that you collect each month. You've got some cost of goods sold. For most software, SaaS startups, you have 85 to 90% plus gross margins, but you want to factor that in. However, all business models aren't the same. There are other business models where it might be software plus you've got this labor component that has to be involved for the ongoing for implementation. Well, factor that in. If you've got 70% gross margins, it doesn't mean you can't be successful, but you have to think about that when you're calculating LTV. The other problem is that when you have low churn, this formula produces LTV numbers that are way too high. Because let's say let me give an example here. Remember, this is the formula. Let's say you have 0.8% monthly churn. So if I divide 100 by 0.8, that's 125 months. And that's completely unrealistic if you're an early stage company. If you've got 1 million in ARR and you've been around for 2 years, do you think there's much of a chance that your average customer is going to be with you for over 10 years? Probably not, right? So much is going to change in that industry with you, with the economy. So what can you do? What's a better way to calculate LTV? Well, 2 adjustments you can make. The first is use this formula instead for calculating your LTV. It's your average MRR multiplied times your gross margin, because that's the money that you can use to offset all your expenses in your company, your non-cost of goods expenses, and you multiply that times the average number of months the customer is there. So let's do this again. For the same customer or company, we've got $500 of average MRR, and we have 85% gross margins, which is pretty standard for a software business, and the same 2.4% churn. And if we use this formula, we can see our LTV is a little under 18,000 instead of being a little under 21,000. That's more accurate. Now, the second thing you can do, and this is I think the real best practice you should also focus on, is only calculate LTV over 48 months. Just max everything out over 4 years. And so how do you do that really easily? You can see online, people will sometimes talk about this and they have more complex formulas, but here's a really easy way. If your monthly churn is 2.0 or greater, it should be 2.0%, use the formula above. Because remember, at 2% churn, your average customer lasts about 50 months. We can call that close enough to 4 years. If your monthly churn is less than 2%, you just use this in formula instead. It's your MRR times your gross margin, and then you just multiply that times 48. You just cap it at 48 months. So let's do another example. You've got $500 average MRR per customer. You've got 85% gross margin, and you have 1.2% monthly churn. Well, that's below 2%. So I'm going to use this formula. It's just 500 times 85%, and I multiply it times 48 months. So now my LTV is a little over 20,000. So let's continue with and go into sort of the LTV to CAC ratio. So as your ARR grows larger, this ratio becomes incredibly important. It gives you sort of insight into how efficiently your business is growing, and are you spending your resources wisely? So if you're factoring in gross margins, like I described on the last slide, and you're cutting off your LTV at 48 months, here's what you want to aim for. Ultimately, as you grow and you get to larger ARR numbers, you want to aim for an LTV to CAC ratio of 3.0 or higher, right? That's your goal. If it's below 3, it generally means you're spending too much to acquire customers. What does it mean that you're spending too much? There's two sides of that equation. You could actually be just spending too much dollars on salaries or on marketing, and you can find ways to do that more efficiently. Or maybe you're focusing on a customer profile that has a much too long of a sales cycle. And there's a different segment that you could focus on that would lower your sales cycle. So those salaries are amortized over a shorter period. You're going to close more deals. That's also going to drive this ratio up. The flip side of this is if your ratio is significantly above 3.0, you should definitely consider spending more aggressively to acquire customers. If you've got an LTV to CAC ratio of 5 or 6, you should be looking at additional ways of acquiring customers. It's okay if you're spending a lot of money on marketing to drive inbound leads to the top of your funnel, and you've identified your most efficient channels where you can acquire customers for the lowest dollars. Well, you might have some other ways of acquiring customers that aren't as efficient, where you're going to spend some more dollars, but it's okay to do that. You don't have to just go for the cream of the crop. Drive more customers in as long as you're keeping your LTV to CAC above 3. Now, if you're at break even or above, with almost absolute certainty, you should be spending more aggressively to acquire customers. If you're below and you're burning cash still, it's more of it's at your discretion type of decision. If you go and you read online, almost all VCs will tell you, if you're above 3, spend more aggressively and drive that ratio down to 3. But remember, that also involves raising a lot more capital. You're going to be burning through money. From a VC's perspective, their goal is always to grow your business as quickly and efficiently as possible. And from the founder's perspective, you might have different goals that sometimes, don't align with that rapid growth at all costs. So, you might want to optimize more for maintaining a higher ownership percentage, right? Or maybe you don't want to have as much operational risk with the crazy high growth rate. That's okay. It's at your discretion if you're burning money still. So here's the key thing, though, is early on in your life cycle, I was just talking about how, it's hard to calculate churn accurately early on. Well, churn's the key driver to calculating LTV, and about how CAC is not very accurate when calculated early on. So the reality is when you're still a young SaaS company, your LTV to CAC ratio doesn't mean much. Your overhead costs are artificially low. Your sales and churn are very lumpy. Your long-term churn rate isn't known. And so at the end of the day, your numbers aren't real. They're not going to be the same as what they level out to being when you get to much higher ARR numbers. So start calculating them. Make sure you're doing it correctly. If they're wildly off, look under the hood and see what you need to deal with, but don't live or die by them at these early stages. So what should you do instead when you're a young SaaS company? Well, to start with, just use net new MRR as the metric you focus on. And net new MRR is very simply how much your MRR increases or decreases from the beginning of the month to the end of the month. It factors in everything. So it's new customers sold, churn customers for MRR lost, upsells, expansion, downgrades from existing customers. If you started the month at 30K MRR and you end at 33,000, that's 3,000 net new MRR. You might have gotten there because no customers churned and you just added 3K of MRR. You might have gotten there because $2,000 of MRR churned and you sold 5,000 of new MRR. Regardless, that's $3,000 of net new MRR. That's what you want to focus on. It's really simple. The next thing to focus on is your product early on. Is it a nice to have or a gotta have product for your customers? And you need to figure that out. It's really hard to sell and scale a nice to have product. You have to be solving a major pain point that customers is top of mind for your customers and they're thinking about, I wish I could solve this. Or you have to be driving very provable new top line revenue or very provable substantial cost savings that they care about. Just because you think your customers should care about this problem doesn't mean they actually do. So is it nice to have or got to have from their perspective? That's what matters, not from yours. The next thing to do is interview all of your churn customers to understand why they left. Now, not everyone's necessarily going to talk to you, but for the most part, if you reach out to a customer that churns and you say, hey, can I take 10 minutes of your time to get on a call and understand, why we weren't a fit for you? They'll usually say yes. And then you can learn, was it actually a problem with the product? Was it a feature set issue or a bug issue? Or is it just that they're not the right profile for you? And no matter what, they weren't going to get a lot of value from your product. And most importantly, build a repeatable, scalable sales process. Forget all the metrics. Just focus on this. If you're adding net new MRR every month, well, you've got a repeatable sales process. That's the absolute most important thing.